Over the weekend, two fellow presidents weighed in on the alleged cover-up of former President Biden's declining health. President Trump trolling Biden on social media, and former President Clinton coming to Biden's defense. Let's bring in Kayla McGee-White, Independent Women Features Editor-in-Chief, and Yemisi Egbawale, Chief of Staff to the White House Press Office under former President Biden. So, apparently, Donald Trump reposted somebody's post on Truth Social claiming that Biden had been executed in 2020 and was replaced by a robotic clone. Clearly, President Trump did not believe that, but he put it out there. And here's what the New York Times wrote. Trump amplifies another outlandish conspiracy theory. Biden is a robotic clone. President Trump reposted another user's false claim that the former president had been executed in 2020 and replaced by a robotic clone. I mean, I know Trump's sense of humor. I'm sure he was just trolling him. What do you think?
Well, I would hope so. But I think also it gets to the real heart of the scandal, which is who in the world was president for the past 4 years if it wasn't Joe Biden? Was it a clone? Was it a cable of White House officials? And I'll say, you know, one of the revealing things about Alex Thompson and Jake Tapper's book is that apparently there were more than 100 people within the White House and in the administration who were well aware of Biden's true mental state the entire time. And yet we still don't have a single name of the people who were making decisions on Biden's behalf. And, you know, for Thompson and Tapper's part, it's quite shocking to me, honestly, that they were willing to give what is essentially immunity to so many of these officials in their book to remain anonymous. Because what that tells me is that you're still trying to cover up the cover-up. You're not interested in true accountability. There are several questions where you do need specific names in order for those questions to be answered.
According to former President Bill Clinton, you don't need the names of the cabal because Biden was just fine. Listen to this.
Thought he was a good president. We'd had several long talks. I had never seen him and walked away thinking he can't do this anymore. He was always on top of his brief.
You never saw any cognitive decline?
So I didn't know anything about any of this, and I haven't read the book.
That would either put him in the minority of the Democratic Party or part of the conspiracy to cover all of this up.
Well, let's look. I'm not going to pretend that Clinton is a neutral assessment of the former president as well. As former presidents, I know that they have a very close relationship. So I can't speak to the times that they spent together. But I can say, speaking to all of the names that haven't been uncovered and people who might have been in the room with Clinton, we'll really never know because with Biden and Clinton.
We know who was in the room with Clinton.
Well, in those moments where it was just the two of them together, I mean, if there were other aides that were there, if they witnessed things, we still haven't heard any names. I mean, I'm concerned about Tapper and Thompson talking about these 3 cabinet members that they said they spoke extensively about cabinet meetings to them on background. And so if we are going to do an investigation, I think it's worth it to hear what these cabinet members have to say with their names present on the record.
All right. So the former White House physician, Congressman Ronny Jackson, weighed in on Dr. Kevin O'Connor, who was Joe Biden's physician. Listen to what he said.
Dr. O'Connor was his physician for 8 years when he was vice president. He literally became part of the Biden family. He would say or do anything that they asked him to do and cover up anything. I truly believe that.
So that's a pretty serious charge. But here's what O'Connor did write in February 2024. President Biden is a healthy, active, robust 81-year-old male who remains fit to successfully execute the duties of the presidency, to include those as chief executive, head of state, and commander-in-chief, which clearly, a few months after that, most people in the Democratic Party said, no way in hell can he be president again.
It was an obvious lie. And the fact that people like Bill Clinton are continuing out there propagating this lie just goes to show that the biggest problem with this scandal is that they don't regret it. I think they regret being caught, but they certainly do not regret covering up Biden's true mental state. And why would they? This is how the Democratic Party has operated for years. In fact, Hillary Clinton herself was a beneficiary of the machine back in 2016. Joe Biden was a beneficiary of it in 2020 when Democratic leaders decided he would be the best candidate to run. And then Kamala Harris was herself a beneficiary of it when they single-handedly put her in as Joe Biden's replacement. So they can't apologize for the scandal because this is how the Democratic Party operates. It's not interested in Democratic representation. It's interested in puppet string politics.
Final word to you.
I'm not going to listen to anything that Dr. Ronny Jackson says. He said that Trump could live to be 200 years. He's been demoted by the Navy. I'm glad he's found his home again, right back in Congress. But I think that it's okay for a doctor to have a close relationship with the President of the United States, especially when they're sharing sensitive information. I didn't see when that report came out in February 2024, Tapper and Thompson ringing the alarm bells.
Had you known that, what would you have said to him?
Had I known what?
That report, what Kevin O'Connor said.
Had I known about the report coming out at that time?
Yeah, had you known what he was going to say, would you have been comfortable with that?
I think I would have been comfortable with it as a staffer because as a staffer, I believed what I was being told at that time.
Ooh. All right. Thank you, ladies. Great to see you. Appreciate it.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.